He was certain the mirror hadn't been there before. The hallway was narrow, barely lit by a weak overhead bulb that flickered more often than it shone, and the space had always been empty, no shelves, no decoration, just a bland, peeling stretch of wallpaper and a creaking wooden floor that never seemed to warm, no matter how many rugs he layered over it. That was why he noticed it immediately. A tall, thin frame, dark wood with ornate edges, a little too tall for the space and placed directly across from his bedroom door, where nothing had ever hung before. It leaned against the wall at a slight angle, its bottom edge resting uncomfortably on uneven floorboards, and the glass itself, though smooth and clean, seemed to warp the reflected light in a way that made the hallway appear subtly off balance. He stood before it for a long time, unsure whether to approach or ignore it. The reflection showed the corridor behind him, the kitchen light glowing faintly at the far end, the shadows reaching upward like stretched limbs. It was all correct, but slightly distorted, not dramatically, not like a funhouse mirror, but with just enough curvature that things appeared somehow deeper, more distant, like the space continued farther in the reflection than it did in reality. He asked the building manager about it the next morning, keeping his voice casual, though he already knew what answer he would receive. The man blinked at him, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and shook his head. "There's never been a mirror in the hallway," he muttered, glancing briefly toward the ceiling as if searching for confirmation. "We don't hang things in the common spaces. Too many people, too easy to damage." That was all. That was enough. When he returned, the mirror was still there. It hadn't moved, hadn't shifted, hadn't done anything to suggest it was more than a misplaced object, but something about it waited, and in that waiting there was pressure, like the presence of an open eye behind glass. He told himself it was nothing, that someone upstairs had placed it there temporarily, that maybe it had always been there and he had simply never noticed. But each night, as he passed it on the way to bed, he found his gaze pulled toward the surface, toward his own face, and what disturbed him wasn't what he saw, but how long he stood looking, sometimes for minutes, sometimes longer, just staring into his own eyes without recognition. Then the reflection began to change. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden movements, no flickering figures, just small inconsistencies, easy to miss if he wasn't paying attention. A picture frame in the background that didn't exist on his wall. A door slightly ajar in the reflection that he knew had been closed. And sometimes, rarely, but enough to keep him from sleeping, his own figure seemed to lag, just barely, behind his movements. Not always. Just when he was tired. Just when the light was wrong. One evening, he reached out and touched the surface, just to feel something real, something physical, and the glass was colder than it should have been, not like room temperature, but like something untouched for years, something kept in shadow. He pulled his hand back immediately, not because of the temperature, but because, for a fraction of a second, he had the distinct and disorienting feeling that the reflection had not moved with him. That night, he dreamt of the mirror, not broken, not dangerous, just open, like a door barely cracked in the middle of a hallway that shouldn't lead anywhere. In the dream, he stood before it, watching himself blink, and on the third blink, his reflection didn't. He woke up without remembering how he'd gotten into bed. By the following evening, he could no longer pretend that the mirror was merely an object. It had become something else entirely, not animate in any traditional sense, not moving or reacting, but instead occupying space in a way that distorted the passage of time and meaning, like a presence that neither advanced nor receded, but simply existed, pressing outward with a silent insistence that refused to be ignored. The hallway felt longer now, subtly expanded, with each step from the living room to his bedroom taking just a little more effort, just a little more time, and though he could never quite measure it, he began to feel that the space around the mirror was stretching, as if the reflection had begun to assert its own dimensions, independent of the apartment it once faithfully echoed. He avoided it during the day, passed quickly, kept his eyes fixed on the floor, told himself not to look, and yet, the moment darkness fell and the soft yellow light flickered overhead, he would inevitably turn his head, not with intention but with submission, as though drawn by a thread too fine to see, and there it would be, his reflection, standing exactly as he stood, but with a quality to the gaze that had become unfamiliar, not hostile, not even curious, but strangely expectant, like a version of himself that had waited too long and now knew something the real him did not.